Mount Everest. Standing at 29,031 feet tall, or 8,848 meters, Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth. And despite standing among some of the other highest peaks in the highest mountain range, as Colonel Howard Berry said, it stands alone, a true monarch among mountains. For this reason, it goes without saying why it's a prestigious accomplishment to conquer Everest. It's implicit in the fact that you cannot find anything higher to climb. But interestingly, due to a combination of its popularity and it not being so technically challenging compared to some of the other 8,000-meter peaks, modern-day Everest has almost lost some of this prestige. The total number of ascents is almost double that of the next most climbed 8,000-meter peak. And in recent years, it's come under scrutiny for being more like a tourist destination than the pinnacle of climbing accomplishment. Paying your way to the top and being the 5,657th person to climb Everest doesn't quite have the same ring to it as being the first ever person to step foot on the highest mountain on Earth. But over 100 years ago, before a map of the area had even been made, a team of some of the most ambitious mountaineers to ever walk the Earth would make the first ever attempt to climb Mount Everest. This is their story. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of Everest is that despite being widely recognized as the tallest mountain in the world today, it wasn't always considered to be the highest. For many years, Everest was thought to be smaller than a neighboring mountain, Kanchenjunga. This was due in large part to the fact that from the Indian side of the mountain, only the tip of Everest is visible among an array of peaks. From the north side, in Tibet, Everest is much more prominent than the surrounding mountains and is clearly the largest among them. However, few people lived in or visited the region, so it wasn't widely known about. And even for those who lived in the region, it was hard for them to definitively say that this one was the largest anywhere on Earth, even if it was the largest in the area. For this same reason, surveying the mountain was completed from the Indian side, where it wasn't well seen. Then, because of this, it was also named after the Surveyor General of India, who directed the triangulation. Interestingly, unlike many other colonial pursuits, native names were used to name mountains whenever possible, and Everest was only given a name when no native name had been assigned. Later, it was learned that from Tibet, the mountain was named Chomolungma, which translates to Goddess Mother of the Mountains. It also has a Nepalese name, Sagarmatha, but this wasn't learned until later either. By the time it was discovered, the name Everest was thought to be too well established to be changed. Another surprising aspect of Everest's history is that despite its status as the highest mountain in the world, it's situated between two of the most secluded countries in the world, Tibet and Nepal. Because of this, it was difficult to get permission to reach Everest once it was realized to be the highest in 1856. The first plan to even climb it began many years later in 1907 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Alpine Club, and it was only then that a series of diplomatic missions made it technically possible. This plan was then delayed due to World War I, so it wasn't all the way until 1920 that the plan was really put into action after permission was granted by the Dalai Lama. In January of 1921, a committee was set up to organize and fund the expedition, and the first planned approach would be a reconnaissance instead of an all-out attempt. This first reconnaissance would become the basis of everything we know about climbing Everest today. The committee then selected a group of experienced climbers. Some had experience in the Himalayas, and others were simply expert climbers. With a fundraising effort, they raised around 10,000 pounds, and the committee was able to purchase the best gear available, including tents, sleeping bags, clothing, boots, ice axes, ropes, cooking equipment, and provisions. This is roughly equivalent to 600,000 pounds today, accounting for inflation.
Then, in April 1921, the team set up from England and arrived in Darjeeling, India at the beginning of May. They hired Sherpas, Bhutias, porters, and 100 army mules to carry their equipment and supplies. After taking about a month to prepare, the team set off on the 300-mile, 483-kilometer trek to reach Mount Everest. The expedition started off in hot and humid jungles, then moved to cool evergreen forests and meadows, and then to cold, dry, and windy conditions as they made their way to higher altitudes. They traversed valleys and high mountain passes that reached as high as 14,300 feet, 4,400 meters. And although these are just stepping stones in the Himalayas, this altitude is roughly equal to the highest mountain in the continental U.S. As they went higher, the terrain became too difficult for the mules, so they had to replace them with hill ponies and yaks. The team also faced the challenge of acclimatizing to the thinning air and low atmospheric pressure. The air became increasingly difficult to breathe, and some team members suffered from altitude sickness. In fact, one of the senior climbers, who was also the team doctor, died of heart failure along the way, and another senior climber got too sick and was forced to return to Sikkim. The expedition pressed on anyway, with the two junior climbers leading the way, despite neither of them having any experience in the Himalayas. As they got closer to Everest, and with the monsoon season fast approaching, the team split off and scouted different areas to speed up their effort. First was a northern reconnaissance to assess the feasibility of climbing the mountain from the northern side. The team explored two glaciers, starting with the Rungbuk Glacier at 17,500 feet, 5,334 meters, where they evaluated the western side of the North Col, and although there was no easy way to reach it, the North Col seemed to offer a route that was feasible for climbing. Next, the team ventured to the West Rungbuk Glacier at 22,500 feet, 6,858 meters. At the same time, another group conducted an eastern reconnaissance, exploring the Karta and Kama valleys, and another pass at 18,000 feet, 5,486 meters. In these valleys, they were surrounded by Makalu, Lhotse, and Everest, three of the 14 8,000-meter peaks and some of the highest on Earth. During the reconnaissance, the team surveyed thousands of square kilometers, and their cartographers created maps of the area. It's hard to overstate just how monumental a task this was. Looking at Everest and the surrounding area on a flat map, you can see the glaciers and ridges and valleys, but it obviously does no justice to what an undertaking it is to even traverse the area. Passing over the mountains themselves isn't feasible. The glaciers are marked with crevasses, and the ridges are sometimes sheer rock. Far above the tree line as well, there is no vegetation, and the weather can be extreme. It also requires more or less a convoy of men and animals to transport the gear and food to supply the effort. Finally, they climbed to 22,000 feet or 6,700 meters at Lag Bala at the end of August and mapped a previously unseen passage. They discovered that an area they thought was impassable would lead them to the North Col after all. With that, they agreed that the reconnaissance was completed and returned to base camp to rest for 10 days. During this time, they rested and prepared for the next phase of their expedition. Rather than simply end it there, they wanted to actually travel to the North Col and get a better idea of what the route was like firsthand. This would make any real attempts that much easier. First, they had to wait until the end of the monsoon season at the end of August, and then they would set foot for the first time in human history on the legendary North Col route. The team then spent roughly the next month slowly establishing camps up the mountain, which would form the basis for their attempt the following year. Eventually, they reached a height of 23,000 feet or 7,010 meters before finally concluding the 1921 reconnaissance. On the 26th of September, the team came down the mountain and made their way out of the shadow of Everest. They finally returned to Darjeeling in October, 6 months after they had left. They had traveled hundreds of miles to reach Everest from an indirect route. They had traveled up and down glaciers and lesser peaks, round and back, enduring harsh weather conditions and rugged terrain. And in that time, 2 of the team members had surveyed a total of 31,000 square kilometers, or 11,970 square miles, producing maps at a scale of 4 miles to 1 inch.
The reconnaissance was considered a massive success, and the committee convened and decided that a full attempt of Mount Everest would be made the following year. Based on what they had learned, they figured that April or May would be the best time to climb because of the unique conditions in the Himalayas. There's just a short window between the winter season and the monsoon season. Winter is far too cold to make a safe attempt, but the summer is cut short by the huge amount of precipitation received by the region during a few months in the summer. As much as 80% of this is received in just a couple of months. In high altitudes, this falls as snow and makes for treacherous climb-in conditions. Not only is there a huge risk of avalanches, but the routes are constantly covered and walking through the deep snow becomes almost impossible. Then, in addition to the short season, due to the distance they had to travel to even get to Everest and the difficult conditions and the high passes along the way, the team had just a tight window to make their attempt. The approach they took was the same as the year before, starting on March 26th with 13 English climbers and a total of 160 men, including Tibetan and Nepalese porters. As with the year before, they started in the state of Sikkim, India, heading north into Tibet, then eastward across Tibet, finally heading south to Everest. Just like before, they had permission from the Dalai Lama to enter Tibet. This time on their journey, they visited the famous Rongbuk Monastery, which sits at 16,400 feet, 5,000 meters, with Everest in the background. Even in May, because of the altitude, it's still much colder. Although daytime temperatures can be well above freezing, nighttime temperatures can drop to double digits below freezing. It would take over a month for the team to finally reach the lower end of the Rongbuk Glacier, where they set up their base camp on May 1st. When they got there, all of the streams were still frozen solid. The party that reached base camp consisted of 300 baggage animals, 20 ponies, and 160 men, many of which were given their pay and left, leaving behind only the essential individuals who would be responsible for the remaining climb. Once everything was unloaded, base camp had a bunch of tents, boxes, bags, animal supplies, and rope strewn across the barren rocks. Then, once it was all set up, the team's first task was to scout ahead and set up Camp 1 closer to the base of Everest. They took some porters and brought up supplies, and to save tents, they even built some stone shelters. There might be half a dozen more camps, and they would need to conserve the tents as best as they could. During this initial movement of all the supplies, the European climbers remarked that the native porters, seemingly even the women and children, were able to navigate the incline and rocky terrain while carrying equipment as if they were walking normally. This is even more incredible once you consider how much thinner the atmosphere is already at these altitudes. Imagine carrying a large bag or box of rice like a backpack, thousands of vertical feet in between camps. This would take an unweighted person a couple of hours to climb, but a porter might be carrying 60 pounds of equipment on their back, and the expedition needed dozens, if not hundreds, of these boxes. It's kind of a paradox, too. You need more people to carry the food, but more people means more mouths to feed, so you need to carry more food to feed those additional people. This meant that in addition to all of the supplies they brought with them, they would need a steady stream of supply drops from the neighboring villages. While Camp 1 was being set up and in preparation for the real climbing, other members of the team worked on and perfected the revolutionary use of bottled oxygen. This idea was initially proposed by Alexander Kellis, the man who had died during the reconnaissance mission the year before. For this 1922 attempt, the team brought this new equipment after it was decided by the committee to use it. This new equipment consisted of 4 oxygen bottles and a fixed frame, and weighed a total of 15 kilograms, 35 pounds. Each bottle could provide oxygen for roughly 2 hours, meaning the full setup could provide oxygen for 8 hours total. It also included a mask that covered the nose and mouth and attached to a tube running back to the bottles.
At the time, this use of bottled oxygen was controversial and considered by purists not to be real climbing. However, the committee eventually decided to bring it after several experts had theorized what type of advantage this might be in the high altitudes. Initially, the idea was dismissed because it was believed that the energy gain wouldn't offset the weight of the equipment itself. However, both the committee and the climbers were later convinced, and so it was added for the 1922 attempts. Some of the party also later remarked how funny it was that the best clothing was used to prevent heat loss, the best tents were used as shelters, but somehow using oxygen was different, as if they weren't equally artificial. Today, obviously, the use of bottled oxygen is the standard for climbing at these heights. The team eventually set up Camp 1 at an altitude of 5,400 meters, or 17,700 feet. They then established Camp 2 at an altitude of 6,000 meters, or 19,700 feet. And finally, set up Advanced Base Camp, also known as Camp 3, at 6,400 meters, or 21,000 feet. Camp 3 was located at the upper end of the glacier below the icy North Col. Each camp was also roughly 3 hours of traveling between for a fully loaded baggage animal, but less for an unloaded person. However, between Camps 2 and 3 was where the true mountain conditions began, including creviced glaciers and unstable seracs. And although the native porters were physically fit, they weren't used to these dangers, and the team had to be extremely cautious from then on. At each camp as well, there were a few men who stayed permanently and could relay messages back and forth. There was also a dedicated cook for each camp so that the camps could function independently while also being linked together. Finally, after fully stocking Camp 3, the team spent some time there before pushing onward again and set up a smaller Camp 4. From there, they had a clear view of a mountain known as Makalu and the approaching monsoon season in the distance. This side of the approaching precipitation made everyone suddenly aware of what little time they had left. Right then, they made the decision to have 4 climbers make the first attempt without oxygen. As everything was still being prepared, small defects had been found in the equipment, which were still being worked out. The team decided that it would be better to try and fail than not try at all. And even if they didn't make that first attempt, they could still make another attempt once those defects were worked out. So on May 19th, a party of 4 British climbers and 9 porters started toward the mountain. They left Camp 3 at 9 a.m., enjoying a nice and sunny day as they made their way along the rock and ice. By 1 p.m., they stopped and set up their tents at Camp 4, where they also set up more rope for the climb up the following day. So far, the attempt seemed very promising. The weather was good, the progress was steady, and they were all in their tents by 4:30 p.m. The following day, the plan was to carry 2 of the smallest tents, 2 double sleeping sacks, food for 36 hours, cooking pots, and thermos flasks. The 9 porters were in good shape and planned to sleep 3 per tent. Everyone was ready for another great day of climbing, but then at 5 a.m., they discovered that the porters had gotten sick throughout the night. The tents they were using weren't well ventilated, and the poor oxygen inside had caused their altitude sickness to progress much more quickly. Coupled with some issues preparing food that morning, the party didn't set off until 7 a.m. But when they did finally set off, it was up the legendary North Col. At first, it was just a snow ridge with a gentle incline. Then, as they climbed, the incline increased, and the ground became icy. This eventually became so steep and so slippery that they knew that steps would need to be cut into the ice sooner or later. This was around the first time that their plan to reach an altitude of 26,000 feet, or 7,924 meters, that day was questioned. As they went higher as well, it got very cold. Even the Europeans were cold, and they had to put on extra clothing. The porters were even colder. Then the ice step cutting proved to be brutally exhausting. It essentially requires that you swing an ice axe into the snow as hard as you can and then step into the spot to flatten it. This took longer than expected, and finally, the party stumbled their way up to a sheltered rock at 25,000 feet, or 7,620 meters, around noon. It was at this point that they realized that getting additional loads higher was too dangerous for the porters. With the thin air and incline, they were already struggling, but the biggest threat was the cold. They decided to send the porters back down that night before they got frostbite or hypothermia.
Once the porters had left, although the Europeans were worn down from the hard day, they eventually pitched their tent at the highest altitude anyone had ever been to, let alone spent the night. The previous record was just 24,600 feet, 7,500 meters. In their excitement for the day ahead, the climbers didn't quite realize how much the cold had already affected them. One of the team members' ears had swollen to 3 times their normal size. Another had frostbitten fingers, and they were all showing the first signs of hypothermia. One thing they'd underestimated was the power of the wind, which could quickly suck the warmth from you or your tent without modern windproofing material. The combination of minimal food, poor rest, and intense physical exertion also made them feel like they were perpetually sick. But despite everything, they would end up falling asleep and desperately hope to get a good night's rest. Throughout the night, they heard the sound of snow and hail hitting their tents and worried about what the path might look like in the morning. And then when the sun finally did come up that morning, one of the men was too sick to continue. At these altitudes, recovery is almost non-existent. Your head aches constantly. This affects your sleep, and then any sleep you do get isn't nearly as restful as it normally is. The other 3 men didn't even question the 4th man. They knew exactly what he was feeling. So finally, at 8 a.m., only 3 climbers continued on. The newly fallen snow covering made the route even more difficult. The ascent that day was over loose rocks and weirdly angled slabs, which were also covered in slippery ice and snow. They also couldn't crawl with their arms because of the spacing of the rocks, so they had to balance on these icy slabs higher than anyone had ever been before. Finally, they reached an altitude of 26,800 feet, still 2,200 feet below the summit. They looked upward and downward and contemplated what to do next. Even if they somehow made it to the top, which already seemed unlikely, they knew that the descent afterward would be impossible. After discussing it, they all knew they needed to turn back before they ran out of strength. They started their descent at 4 p.m. and were back at Camp 4 by nightfall. Rather than waiting until the following day, they gathered their gear and the 4th man and then headed back down immediately. Even though they were all exhausted, they couldn't spend another night at that altitude with no food. Unfortunately, as with the way up that day, the route back down was much more treacherous than before due to the fresh snow. All the rocks they had previously climbed now had a slick layer of snow covering them. At one point, one of the men slipped and took 2 others with him. At the last second, the final man managed to dig in with his ice axe and stop their fall. Had he not stopped them, they would have tumbled to the glaciers thousands of feet below. They spent the next 5 hours in the darkness climbing down, cutting steps, and navigating over and around crevasses. Finally, at 11:30 p.m., one of them tripped over a rope at Camp 3. At this point, all they could think about was finding something to eat. They searched for fuel and cooking pots to make food, but they found nothing in the darkness. They ended up resorting to eating a mixture of jam, snow, and frozen condensed milk, which only upset their stomachs further. Finally, they fell asleep once again, but it was another terrible night of sleep. They woke up starving almost as badly as the night before and left just after sunrise, desperately needing to get down to some hot food. As the men made their way down from Camp 3, they encountered 2 more of the European climbers who were on their way up. They were bringing oxygen cylinders to stock Camp 3 and wanted to test out the new equipment after working out all the defects. The 2 parties happily greeted each other and then went their separate ways. On May 22, 1922, something unprecedented occurred that would change high-altitude climbing forever. The day after passing by the 4 men who had attempted Everest without oxygen, the 2 other European climbers went up to the North Pole and back from Camp 3 in just 3 hours and 40 minutes. Not only was this incredibly fast, but it wasn't even all that hard for the 2 men. This was the first demonstration of what a game-changer bottled oxygen is. Following this test, a second attempt was planned to be made on May 24th. This was the full attempt that everyone had planned for. a team of 4 Europeans and 12 porters set off from Camp 3 and brought all the supplies and oxygen up to Camp 4 at the North Col. They camped there for the night at 23,000 feet, and then the following day, the porters set off first with the intention of meeting up at 26,000 feet.
The 4 European climbers left about an hour and a half later, and despite carrying heavier loads than the porters, they ended up overtaking them on the way up. This only cemented the fact that oxygen was essential for any attempts thereafter. At around 1 p.m., the European climbers decided that they should stop about 500 vertical feet, or 152 meters, below their initial plan because the wind had picked up and snow had begun to fall. They could have traveled higher, but that would have meant that the porters, who also had to descend that day still, would have to travel farther in worse conditions. So instead, they stopped and started setting up their camp for the day. They scouted up a little and around the small area they had to work with, but eventually settled on a narrow ledge overlooking a steep precipice. The porters arrived shortly after and dropped off the gear and helped set up. Once everything was done, they set off down the mountain again, singing as they went. The Europeans then settled in their tents for a bitterly cold night. They cooked a small hot meal, which doesn't really get truly hot at those altitudes. The low pressure means that the boiling point of water is also lower, and so the water doesn't get quite as hot as it does at sea level. After their meal, and over a cigarette, they discussed their chances of success and felt confident that between the weather and the bottled oxygen, the chance of summiting was good. However, as is often the case in the mountains, the weather completely changed in the course of a few hours, along with their confidence. Soon enough, gale-force winds were sweeping through their camp and lifting the tent off the ground with all of them inside. The force of the wind was also finding its way inside the tent and rapidly cooling all of them down. For hours, they fought for their lives in a tent that was precariously perched on the edge of a cliff. The wind was causing the tent to flap so loudly that the climbers described it like the sound of a machine gun. It was so loud that they could barely hear each other speak. Finally, as dawn broke, the snow stopped, but the wind continued to rage on. They cooked food inside the tent, trying to stay warm and preserve their strength. But just as they thought they might be safe, the wind got worse, and a sharp stone tore through the fabric of their tent. This might have been the end of all of them, if not for the fact that luckily, the wind died down just half an hour later at around noon. By then, it was too late for an attempt that day, so they decided to sleep another night on the ledge and try again the following day. The confident expressions they had on their faces just 12 hours earlier had turned to weariness after the long night of fighting. Up until this point, it was thought that the oxygen should be reserved only for the climbing itself. They had only a limited supply, and the climbing itself was the most strenuous, so it just made sense to reserve the oxygen for then. But then, randomly, they had the idea to just try breathing from the cylinders while resting in the tent. Even if it made a small difference, that might be exactly what they needed. Again, the oxygen proved to be much more effective than anyone could have imagined. Almost immediately, the effects were clear as the men felt warmer and their facial expressions seemed to change in seconds. That night, they rigged up a system so that just a little bit of oxygen came through their masks. That way, they could sleep with their masks on while also conserving the majority of the oxygen for climbing. The result was that their sleep was much more restful and they were much more recovered than they otherwise would have been. The following morning, they were fresh and ready to go, despite being very hungry because they hadn't brought enough food to account for the extra day in the storm. After getting on their frozen boots, they set off at 6:30 a.m., still carrying between 40 and 50 pounds each. Thankfully, the weather was good to start the day. Unfortunately, just an hour into climbing, one of the men collapsed and fell forward onto his breathing apparatus. The altitude and the preceding days had taken their toll, and the man could no longer continue. They couldn't afford to accompany him back to the tent, so they removed his gear and sent him down on his own. The way was clear, and the tent was still visible down below, so they had no fear of him going alone. Following his departure, the three men pressed on in an area that wasn't very steep, and the rocks were not difficult to climb. In this easy terrain, they unroped and moved more quickly. But again, this pace was unfortunately short-lived. At 26,500 feet, or 8,077 meters, the wind resumed with almost the same strength as the day prior.
To get out of the wind, the men made the decision to traverse around and onto the massive north face for shelter. This was fine at first, but then it became steeper and the rocks made for terrible footing. They painstakingly scrambled onward until finally stopping at 27,300 feet, 8,321 meters. From that height, they were higher than everything else on the horizon. There are just 5 mountains whose peaks are higher than they were at that very moment. But looking up, there were still almost 2,000 feet to go. Again, they knew if they continued, they wouldn't make it back alive. Soon they were back down to high camp and found the man who had been sent back down earlier was asleep and wrapped in 3 sleeping bags. He was still too weak to join them, so they told him to wait for porters they would send up to get him. Exhausted themselves, the men continued on down the mountain. They got down to camp at the North Col at 4 p.m., and at this point, they were having a hard time bending their legs because of how tired and hungry they were. They stopped briefly to retrieve some of the stored food and then set off again, desperately wanting to get to Camp 3. Finally, they would make it down to Camp 3, and from their highest point early in the day, they had descended 6,000 vertical feet, 1,800 meters. Once they undressed, they found that they were suffering from varying degrees of frostbite on their feet, hands, and face. At least one of them would need to be carried down to base camp the following day. Following the second failed attempt, the entire team spent some time resting at base camp to recuperate. The first team had already been there for some time, and with the weather still good, they all discussed the possibility of making a third attempt before the monsoon season had fully arrived. It was fast approaching, and this was evident because Everest was now no longer visible through a thick fog after about 10 a.m. every day. Still, it did seem to be late that year, so eventually the team decided on another attempt. On June 3rd, they left base camp once again, hoping to be the first ever to set foot on the highest point on Earth. They reached Camp 1 and spent the night there, only to experience heavy snowfall throughout the night. By June 5th, they reached Camp 3 and discovered that the remaining tents were filled with snow and ice. Buried were supplies and had to be dug out, with snow depths reaching over a foot, a half a meter, and snow drifts were even higher. On June 6th, the weather cleared up and the men climbed again on a bright, sunny day. Despite their fatigue, the team had learned valuable lessons from their previous attempts. They were more comfortable using their oxygen tanks, and they knew now that they needed much more food to sustain their activity levels at these higher altitudes. They also decided that the camp at 25,000 feet was too low and aimed for a higher one this time around. On June 7th at 8 a.m., the team began their ascent to the North Col. This time around, the European climbers were wary of all the fresh snowfall and the increased risk of avalanches. They assessed the route and determined that the steep final slope of the shelf they were on might be the only problematic area. But to be sure, they needed to actually test the snow and try to trigger an avalanche. On their way up, the snow was knee-deep and made their walk exhausting. The team alternated the man in front and left him free of any equipment to stomp out a path for the porters. With the fresh snow as well, the routes they had made previously were now completely covered. Eventually, they reached the section they were worried about and performed a series of tests to try to trigger an avalanche. Each time the snow held, and given that this was the steepest and iciest section, if they couldn't trigger an avalanche here, there wouldn't be any risk going forward. They continued onward through the deep snow and often needed to pause and take several hard breaths for just a single step. At this point, there were about 1,000 feet below Camp 4, and the incline was still only a gentle slope. There was no wind either, so all they could hear was the quiet and the sounds of their breath and the crunching of the snow below their feet. Then the silence was broken by an ominous soft explosion. Everyone knew what the sound meant. They jumped upward as the snow dissolved in front of them, and then they were slowly swept down the mountain. They powerlessly rode the wave of snow that seemed almost peaceful at first instead of dangerous, but then they slipped underneath the top layer and the snow covered them completely. Instinctively, they swam their arms around trying to free themselves until they felt the snow starting to slow down. Then it began to tighten around them further and further until they wondered if they were going to be crushed. Then everything stopped.
Some of the men were able to stand up right away and look around to survey the area. 4 of them seemed to be grouped close by. There was another group of porters about 150 feet away, but there were still too many missing. They could have been suffocating somewhere under the snow. In reality, the individuals who were further behind on the route had traveled faster and farther. They ran to where the porters were standing and realized that right behind them there was a sheer cliff about 50 feet high. Everyone who wasn't with them had been swept over the edge. The remaining men found a route down the cliff to hopefully find anyone alive down below. What they found, though, was that at the bottom of the cliff there was also a crevasse. Many of the others had fallen in and then were buried by the snow that fell on top of them. They desperately dug away the snow and climbed down into the icy crack, but in the end, only a few men were found alive. Some of them had been crushed by the weight of the snow, some had died in the fall, and others had simply gone too long without oxygen. A total of 7 porters would eventually pass away as a result of the avalanche, and without anyone explicitly saying it, everyone knew that this was the official end of the 1922 Mount Everest expedition. At Camp 3, a cairn was built to honor the men who died, and it was decided that their bodies would be left on the mountain where they had died. In recollecting the events of that day, the climbers wondered how it was possible that despite their testing, an avalanche could have occurred on such a gentle and innocent-looking slope. These early attempts to conquer Everest stand as some of the most astonishing feats in human history. This was not only the first attempt to summit Everest, but also the first effort to climb any 8,000-meter peak. From the intricate mapping to the organization of people and supplies to the actual climbing itself, these attempts were groundbreaking on every level. And what makes the first climb particularly awe-inspiring is that it was carried out without the use of supplemental oxygen. Not only do modern climbers rely on oxygen to assist them during their ascents, they're also equipped with better clothing, gear, expert guides, and established routes. There are also more camps used, and they extend higher up the mountain to minimize the distance to travel each day. We've also learned a ton about acclimatizing at high altitudes. It's now understood that spending time living at higher camps can help climbers acclimatize and make the ascent considerably easier. So despite lacking all of these advantages, these early climbers managed to reach within just 2,000 feet of Everest's summit. These attempts laid the groundwork for everything we know about climbing Everest today and significantly influenced the next major attempt in 1924. Hello everyone, my name is Suro and welcome to French Ambiance. Thank you all so much for watching and hopefully I will see you in the next one.